You're watching the Chucktown Wind Report Extended Weekday Outlook from Tuesday, September the 22nd through Friday, September the 25th. Okay, lots to talk about this week as things look rather messy in the southeast with this frontal boundary to the south. Now, as we talked about in the last couple of forecasts, high pressure to the north. This high pressure is fairly moderate. It's about 1,024 millibars. It's expected to build to about 1,028 millibars, I believe. As we see high pressures to the north wedging down a north or northeast wind down into these frontal boundaries as low pressures develop along them, sometimes we get a spin, and now we have an area out here that has redeveloped from remnants of 96L, which are somewhere down here, and now the new area of spin is from low pressure trying to close off the South Carolina, North Carolina coast, and it's been given a very low chance for development, and we'll get into that in a little bit. However, it will add to the messiness this week as this high pressure drives this moisture into the coastline from the north, and this frontal boundary pulls moisture from the Gulf of Mexico up from the southwest. So what we're looking at is a continued northerly flow down the coastline from that high pressure to undercut these southerly winds down below this boundary. Now, this may be a tug of war this week as this boundary meanders north overnight and then back to the south during the daytime with heating as a cold front, warm front at nighttime with some of the cooler land mass that it tends to migrate towards at nighttime. So kind of a very tricky situation with a meandering cold front, or what we call an undulating front, as it meanders to the north and back to the south and small low pressures develop along it. We're looking at widespread rains and showers for the next couple of days, and that does not look to break. So we're going to be in and out with rains, and that's going to be a higher chance. Now, this ridge of high pressure extends all the way out to the Midwest, and it's sort of set up to the north of this boundary. So it's going to keep this sort of a northeasterly flow going. I'd say north-northeast to northeasterly flow going. As this area right here develops off the shore, it should stay intact for the most part, and what we're going to have is we're going to have a trough or a short wave of upper low pressure develop over the top of this boundary. That will be kind of a steering current into the coastline with this high pressure to the north going this way. This low pressure out here is going to be heading slowly to the west, so we're expecting even more or a higher chance of rain to enter into our area by the end of the week. So that looks to be the pattern. I think we're going to see for our coastline, for Charleston area, we'll probably see some of these moderate north-northeast, or at least today, maybe 12 to 16 knots. It could be up and down. We could see one of these wind fields that are just unstable, where we see some pulses into the mid to upper teens and then backing down to the low teens because of this frontal boundary activity. And there could be some periods of time where these winds go variable right along with this boundary trout drifts right over the coastline, and then the northerlies pick up. This sort of activity makes a wind forecast very tricky because for the most part, the direction that the models will agree with is usually for the dominant feature, which is going to be this high pressure to the north. However, we could see some variable periods. But we'll go ahead and stick for now. We'll go ahead and stick with the north-northwesterly wind field today, or I'm sorry, north-northeasterly wind field for today, reaching about 12 to 16 knots, maybe a little bit lower in valleys and then a little bit higher in peaks. And I say probably 9 to 16 knots if you want to put more of a 7-knot spread on it. As we get into tomorrow, this frontal boundary should push a little bit further down to the south as this ridge actually builds down, and then we see those northerlies actually build tomorrow. Now, the directions are going to be toggling between north, north-northeast, and northeast. So, like I said, it's going to be another unstable day for tomorrow, ahead with ups and downs. The flow should build stronger and even into Thursday as more of a northeast flow as this high pressure builds down. This low pressure looks like it's going to drift to the west, so that means the wind field could turn a little bit more northeast along our coastline. This is going to be very tricky. We'll take it day to day as we watch these two areas pinch together along our coastline. The wind field can get pretty shifty at times and go between east-northeast, northeast, and north-northeast. With plenty of ups and downs, as we always see with these tropical lows or subtropical lows off the coastline. So that's going to be for this week. We're looking at sort of a building 1, 2, 3, and the northerly today being weaker, tomorrow being a little bit stronger, and then to Thursday being probably the peak period, and then Friday being a complete washout as winds switch up, probably to the northwest or maybe even from the south as this low drifts over the coastline. So Friday is going to be our big variable question mark as to what's going to actually happen with the wind field. But we do see northerlies building today, tomorrow, and Thursday. Okay, so I definitely want to take a look at our radar for right now, and you can see this frontal boundary lifting as a warm front out here to our west across the midstate near Augusta and then over towards Atlanta. And you can see some of this thunderstorm activity happening this morning where this warm front boundary is. And then along the coastline over here, a lot of this is clutter around the Savannah and Statesboro area. There are a few little patches of rain here and here. But if you look over at the coastline, you see the moisture and rains coming down from the northeast, and then over here they're lifting to the north. So we have a sort of a split in the radar which way the moisture is coming from, and that's due to these surface winds driving these rains down from the northeast. And then over here with this frontal boundary lifting, you can see the moisture lifting to the north. So that just makes it even trickier. If we look at data scope from weather flow, you can see the winds right now are from the northeast. In the harbor over the open area, we're looking at about 10 knots, and those are expected to slowly climb as the day goes on. Now I want to take a look at the models, the computer models that are available for today, and see what the guidance is on it. Now as we get into today, you start to see a split in these speeds with the WaveWatch Model 3. The browner one up here at the top goes a little bit higher. That's sort of an extension of the GFS model. And then you see some of these higher resolution models like the HRR3K in the red and the North American model 5K in the green, where they get a little bit more jumpy. And those are the ones I tend to pay attention to a little bit more, simply because they're a little more dialed into mixing the water features with the land features, and they capture some more of the characteristics of the area. Whereas these medium resolution models, the 12 kilometer all the way up to the 0.5 degree, they sort of do more of a smoother, more of a general swath of the area, so it smooths out the forecast for the winds. So that's what we're looking for today. We're looking at low teens from the higher resolution models. Actually, the North American model keeps winds below 10 knots. That could very well be the case. We could see, like I said, that 7-knot spread from anywhere from 8 or 9 knots all the way up to 15 or 16 knots as the day goes on with those peaks and valleys in the wind field. Now as we get into tomorrow, most models still agree with this north or north-northeast flow. As we get into the morning hours, the speeds really, they keep differences on the speeds because of the high pressure to the north and the low pressure over the area, so that really makes for trickiness in that. And as we get into Thursday, that's where we start to see the models split in their agreement, where the Canadian model actually goes west below the boundary as it reads the boundary lifting back from the south. And then you see the other models are in more agreement with the northerly flow. And these are more the medium resolution models, and they start to become more and more in disarray as we get later into the week. So another one of those things, we'll have to take it day to day. But as we see, Thursday tends to sort of be the peak morning winds overnight. Tuesday afternoon, this afternoon, and into Wednesday builds, and then as we get into Thursday, we see the final build and the peak out. So that may have to go day to day with the forecast, just based on a lot of the trickiness. Okay, let's take a look at the tropical Atlantic, and we see Ida way over here to the east. This is an upper level low in this area here, and then here's this new area that has been designated as Invest 97L, and this is remnants of Invest 96L that was being watched just a few days ago that dissipated, and now we have some new remnants along a newer frontal boundary. So they have designated it as a new area of interest. Okay, so we look at the National Hurricane Center page. This is Invest 97L, formation 10% in the next 48 hours and 20% over the next 5 days. They do not expect it to become tropical, rather subtropical, and that has a lot to do with that cooler northerly wind coming down, and also the water temperatures in that area. They are favorable. It's about 29 or 30 degrees Celsius, or somewhere in the low 80s for over the Gulf Stream. So that could be conducive for development. However, there is some upper level shear going on that is supposed to keep the chances of this formation down drastically. If we look at a data scope again, and we put the radar with the satellite and the winds, and let this load for just a second here. There we go. We can see just a little bit of surface rotation right over here next to this buoy out here, and we're seeing this easterly flow being pulled into it at about 21 knots. Now the gradient is tighter up here along the outer banks, where we're seeing some of those low and even mid-20s up to 24 and 25 knots, where this low is interacting with high pressure. And even from the frontal boundary, so we have a lot of mixing going on, but you can see the winds cranking up from 17 to 21, and not a very stable wind field on its own. However, it is in the 20s, so we're looking at somewhat strong winds there, and as we get down the coastline, we see moderates sort of taper off down to modest northerlies. Okay, East Coast infrared loop. Here's 97L here. You can barely see a surface rotation starting to begin right about here. It looks like there's quite a bit of dry air pulling up from the south, so that could have a negative effect on any kind of development for this storm. Here's the rainbow loop for this. You can see this drier air being pulled up from the south, and you can notice the cloud tops on this. Now I want to go back to the infrared loop. And one thing you notice is you see this cloud, this cloud streaming up from the south, and then you see these cloud tops over 97L being pulled off to the north, and that has a lot to do with the upper level shear that I talked about, and that's why the formation of a tropical system is going to be very low. Subtropical maybe. Subtropical from the northeast winds with the cooler air gives it more of a cooler core, and as it heads west over the shelf waters where the waters are in the upper 70s, that's what's going to be giving it a subtropical characteristic, if anything at all. I don't think it'll be tropical in nature simply because of the cooler air, and that's one of the main characteristics of subtropical system is a cooler core. Okay, so let's take a look at the 500 millibar wind pattern. I want to see what is going on up high. This is about 18,000 feet, and we see this trough pulling down into the southeast region. Now this is indicative of a short wave of low pressure or upper low pressure trying to develop, and this is probably what's going to be the steering pattern for this system to move into the coastline. Now you can see where the surface rotation was right here in the green circle. I left that as is, and down here is where the displaced center of low pressure is. So you see this is the surface low, and then this is the medium level, the mid-level low. That means that the surface low, that the low pressure is displaced at the surface in the mid-levels, and the exhaust is not very well. That is indicative of a very weak or disorganized system. So if we go a little higher up to about 34,000 feet or 250 millibars, get a better idea of the upper level shear that we see coming from the southwest, and that's what's blowing these cloud tops up to the north of this system and keeping it very well disorganized. Now here you saw that the mid-level low was down here, and here's the upper level low over here. So if we look at a side profile of this, you would want to have sort of a low pressure center. If you're looking at this at a side profile, here's the surface low. You want exhaust to go up and out through the top, and then your outflow to be optimal for breathing for these storms. And what you end up having is you have a displaced mid-level. Let me draw it here. Here's your surface low, and then you have another medium, let's say mid-level low way over here, and then you actually have this over here. So what you have is exhaust that's going this way and this way, and it makes it very hard for the storm to breathe or get anything going for outflow for the storm. So that's what makes it very difficult for any kind of system like this to actually make it. Okay, go back to water vapor loop. Here's the drier air to the south of 97L. Here's an upper level low, the upper level low I talked about earlier, and here's Ida over here. Real quick, I definitely want to take a look at the modeling. So the GFS model for this system out here off of our coast at 0 hours. This is as of midnight last night. The models came out for the GFS, and I'm just going to make a run, and it's going to go every 6 hours. This run takes this system into our coastline. So you can see where the energy from it is heading towards the South Carolina coast. That's based on the GFS over the next 66 to 72 hours, where whatever is left of 97L will be making its landfall over us. That is for Friday, September the 25th at midnight. So that's why I say towards the end of the week, then the chances of rain increase and it could get even messier. And if we look at the European model for this very same thing, we'll look at the lower dynamics, and we'll do the same run on this system. And there it is out here. So if we do the run on the Euro model and put 24 to 48 hours out and even into 72 hours out, it actually brings this system a little bit lower than South Carolina and down into Georgia and northern Florida. So one way or the other, it definitely looks like the system is going to make a westerly push and have its effects on the east or the southeast coast. Okay, here's Ida. Ida is pretty tricky because the surface rotation is somewhere out here, and a lot of these cloud tops are being pulled actually to the southeast. Now the rainbow loop, you can't really get a good idea, but you can see the blotch of convection is actually being pulled down to the southeast. Now Ida's prediction for the National Hurricane Center is to stay a tropical storm. She is at 45 miles an hour. The movement is expected to be north-northwest at 5 miles an hour. However, latest movement of Ida has been taking the surface circulation actually to the southeast along those cloud tops. So now the track is starting to change as she's sort of caught between Scylla and Charybdis out there. If we look at I'm going to go back to earth.nullschool.net. Let's look at the steering pattern for Ida and probably see some interesting things. Wait for this to load. Let me go back down to the surface here. Okay. I'll put the green dot on Ida. And we'll look at the 500 millibar chart. There's the surface. Okay, and here again with Ida is a displaced low pressure, center of low pressure. So here's the surface, here's the mid-level, and let's go a little bit higher up to 34,000 feet. And there we are. So here's this huge upper level low right here. I call this Charybdis, and then all this over here, the Scylla. We have this upper level shear diving down from the north and swooping over to the east. And then this sort of upper level steering current right here could bring Ida back down to the southeast, and where she could just meander in this area for days to come. So even though the track does pull her north around the backside of this upper level low, I think she's going to get pulled down to the southeast and sort of meander around for days. It could become a more favorable environment down in this area. So we'll have to wait and see what happens there. Elsewhere in the tropics, look at total precipitable water. Here's Ida right here, feeding off of moisture coming up from the south off the intertropical convergence zone. Here is the bulge of moisture being pushed in from the east for Invest 97L off of our coast right now. If we look at the Saharan air layer coming off of Africa, really not much coming off, no tropical waves coming off of Africa right now, and the Saharan air layer is rather moderate. The dusting here is keeping things down. There was a small wave that came off that got dissipated by this mid-level dust in the atmosphere, and that's very typical of the moderate dusting that comes off of those deserts. Okay, back to Charleston. Quick recap. Today, northerlies, 12 to 16 knots in peaks and valleys, so we could be looking at more of a 7 or 8 knot spread between 8 and 16 knots. As we get into tomorrow, we should be looking at a stronger build. We could be looking at 13 to 17 knots north or northeasterly winds, and that once again peaks and valleys there. And as we get into Thursday, we start to see those winds sort of taper off in the late afternoon. We're watching that low pressure as it heads towards the coastline to cause those ups and downs and peaks and valleys. So again, lots of rains, showers, possible thunderstorms mixed in with everything. It looks like a pretty messy week ahead. And that will do it for the Chucktown Wind Report. Thanks for watching.